It means in an electronic way or using electronics. Electronics is the study of electricity and the things that use electricity. Listen to the way electronic is used here.
It is a new frontier, and there are old traditional forms of crime being committed electronically and via computers and the internet, but there are also new crime types emerging. Electronic crime really does cross over a whole range of different crime types.
Electronic crime really does cross over a whole range of different crime types. He uses the phrases electronic crime and committed electronically. Notice that electronic, the adjective, comes before the noun crime, but that the adverb electronically comes after the verb committed. Let's look at the table again. We have electronic, the adjective, electronically, the adverb, and electronics, the noun. You'll notice that not all words take all these different forms, but where they do exist, you'll be able to see patterns emerging. For example, look at the adverbs criminally and electronically. They both end in ly, ly. Okay, so we've looked at electronic and its word family. These days, electronic is often used to mean relating to computers or new technologies. It sometimes gets shortened to E. We have email, electronic mail, e-business, electronic business. So we could call these electronic crimes e-crimes, crimes committed using computers and the internet. But what sorts of e-crimes are being committed? Listen for the two main types of crimes that he mentions.
Electronic crime really does cross over a whole range of different crime types. You can imagine stalking offences that may be facilitated via email, harassment, threatening emails, small-scale fraud offences, right up through to large-scale frauds committed via the internet.
He mentions two main types of crimes: stalking offences and fraud offences. An offence is another word for a crime. Notice how you can build your vocabulary by looking at words on a theme. An offence is a crime, and offenders are criminals. But look at some other crime words. We've got robbery and robbers, burglary and burglars. And there are lots more. You should try to learn words in themes like this. See how many words you can find for different types of crimes and criminals. Okay, now let's have a quick look at some spelling. Spelling is very important in formal writing, but English spelling is very difficult. There aren't too many rules and most of them can be broken. Notice that many words can have doubled letters, but you can't tell by just listening to the words. In today's story, we've seen the words committed, electronically, different, cross, harassment, and offences. They have all got doubled letters. There aren't really any rules for spelling these words. You have to learn them all one by one. When you come across new words, try writing them down a few times and spelling them out loud. Notice in Australia and England, we spell doubled letters out by saying the word double before them. Double F, double S. But in the United States, they just say the letter twice. FF, SS. So you can choose either way, but you should learn to recognise both. Listen to this. Different. D-I-F-F-E-R-E-N-T. Different. Harassment. H-A-R-A-S-S-M-E-N-T. Harassment. And electronically. E-L-E-C-T-R-O-N-I-C-A-L-L-Y. Electronically. Notice that even though English spelling can be very difficult, it's very important to make sure you spell words correctly. It makes your writing look bad if you misspell words in essays, so you'll need to work hard at it. So our lessons for today are: write down new words you find. Check the spelling in a dictionary to make sure you've spelt them correctly. See if you can find other words that belong to the same family. Can the word be used as a noun or verb? Write all the word forms in your word family table. Don't forget that it's very useful to keep your words listed according to topics, like crime words, business words, or computer words. And that's all we've got time for today. I'll see you for the next episode of Study English. Bye-bye. Hello, I'm Margot Pilatus. Welcome to Study English, IELTS preparation. Today we're going to look at ways of discussing a topic. When you're writing or speaking, you can present facts or you can use your opinion. But how can you tell the difference? Today we'll find out. We're going to listen to a scientist talking about vitamin D and cancer. In this clip, see if you can hear both facts and opinions being used.
I believe that the public health problem for vitamin D deficiency is quite significant. I would estimate minimum 25% of adults in the United States, Europe, and probably even in Australia are vitamin D deficient. I mean, if you think about it, over 250,000 women in the United States will develop breast cancer this year. Something like 50,000 will die. If 25% of those breast cancers could have been averted, prevented in some way, just by having a little exposure to sunlight, would have been really tremendous.
So he was talking about the links between vitamin D and cancer. Many Australians these days are avoiding the sun because they know it can cause skin cancer. But by avoiding the sun, they're missing out on vitamin D, the vitamin that you get from sunshine. And this is leading to other health problems. When you're reading, writing, or listening to an argument like this, it's important to be able to tell the difference between statements of fact and statements of opinion. But how can you tell the difference? Well, there are a number of ways you can express your opinion. Today, we're going to look at two of these, using phrases that express an opinion and using modal verbs. First, let's look at some phrases. The key words to listen for when you're trying to decide whether someone is talking about facts or opinions are words like believe, think, argue, feel, opinion, or view. These vary from formal to informal. If I was talking with my friends, I might say, I think or I believe. If I was in a class or tutorial, I might say, in my opinion, or in my view. But if I was writing an essay or giving a very formal talk, I'd probably choose, it is believed, or it is thought. In formal writing, many people think you should avoid using the word I, even if you are giving an opinion. Here's the clip again. Listen for some of those phrases.
I believe that the public health problem for vitamin D deficiency is quite significant. I mean, if you think about it, over 250,000 women in the United States will develop breast cancer this year. Something like 50,000 will die.
Another way we can express opinions is by using modal verbs. Modal verbs express opinions and attitudes. They make statements less certain or less definite. They can also be used for recommending and advising. Here are the modal verbs used for opinions: would, should, could, might. These words signal that the speaker is giving an opinion. Look at these examples. Can you tell which ones are facts and which ones are opinions? 50,000 will die. 50,000 might die. The second statement uses might. It's an opinion. Here's another one. I do not think small amounts of sunlight increase the risk of cancer. Small amounts of sunlight do not increase the risk of cancer. In the first statement, you can see I do not think. This is an opinion. Now look at these two sentences. I believe that vitamin D deficiency might become common among adults. Vitamin D deficiency will affect 25% of adults. The first is an opinion. I believe, might become. The second is a fact. Will affect 25% of adults. Now let's watch the clip again. Listen for the phrases and modal verbs of opinions.
I believe that the public health problem for vitamin D deficiency is quite significant. I would estimate minimum 25% of adults in the United States, Europe, and probably even in Australia are vitamin D deficient. I mean, if you think about it, over 250,000 women in the United States will develop breast cancer this year. Something like 50,000 will die. If 25% of those breast cancers could have been averted, prevented in some way, just by having a little exposure to sunlight, would have been really tremendous.
Okay, so you can see that Professor Hollick is expressing an opinion using a combination of phrases and modal verbs. But now we're going to look at some pronunciation tips. When you're learning English, there are three very important parts of pronunciation. They are word stress, sentence rhythm, and intonation. Today we're going to look at the first two, how you can practice word stress and sentence rhythm together to improve your spoken English. Listen to this sentence closely for word and sentence stress.
I don't think we should blame moderate, intelligent exposure to sunlight throughout our lives as the culprit for markedly increasing our risk of developing skin cancer.
Notice that the speaker uses many words with more than one syllable. That is common in formal academic language. But when you come across longer words, you have to learn which syllable to stress. For example, we say intelligent, increasing, and markedly. Notice that when you stress one syllable, the vowels in the other syllables are shortened. Sometimes these short syllables become a schwa, an sound, or an I. They're short, relaxed sounds. Listen to moderate, intelligent, exposure, culprit, markedly, developing, cancer. This shortening of syllables preserves the overall sentence rhythm. Listen to the clip again.
I don't think we should blame moderate, intelligent exposure to sunlight throughout our lives as the culprit for markedly increasing our risk of developing skin cancer.
So when you're learning to speak English, you need to learn the pronunciation of individual words, but you also need to practice sentence rhythm, putting the words together into sentences. This is much easier when you get used to shortening the non-stressed vowels. Okay, listen to the clip and then we'll practice some more.
I mean, if you think about it, over 250,000 women in the United States will develop breast cancer this year. Something like 50,000 will die. If 25% of those breast cancers could have been averted, prevented in some way, just by having a little exposure to sunlight, would have been really tremendous.
Okay, now you can try it. Listen to this sentence. It would have been tremendous to have averted or prevented significant vitamin D deficiency. Let's look at each of those words. We'll highlight which syllable is stressed. See if you can work out how to pronounce each word. Tremendous, averted, prevented, significant, vitamin, deficiency. Okay, now let's see what happens when we put these words back into a sentence. It would have been tremendous to have averted or prevented significant vitamin D deficiency. Making your spoken English sound natural takes a lot of practice. Don't forget to listen closely to vowel sounds and sentence stress, and remember to practice reading and writing in English every day. And that's all from me today. I'll see you next time on Study English. Bye. Hello, I'm Margot Politis. Welcome to Study English, IELTS preparation. Today we're going to talk about businesses and different ways to discuss economic information. We're going to listen to an interview with the head of a large clothing company. Then we're going to look at how he describes the success of his company. Here's Derek O'Neill.
Well, we've said before that we've had consistent growth over the last 4 to 5 years. We've delivered EPS growth in excess of 20% over the last 3 years. Growing earnings at 25, 30, 35% forever becomes impossible. I think we end up owning US GDP in about 2023 with 25% growth. We've registered that 15% is our plan, and we think that's a good target. We're very happy with our level of sales. We grew sales in the US in girls wear at 50%, and we think that's a fantastic performance. So we'll stand by those numbers. We've had solid momentum in that market for 4 or 5 years, and we expect that momentum's going to continue.
Okay, so today we're going to look at the language of description, particularly describing economic information. In formal academic writing, it's important to use impersonal, objective language when describing things. Notice that in the interview, Derek O'Neill often begins his sentences with we've, short for we have. Using phrases like I've or we've is very common in spoken English.
Well, we've said before that we've had consistent growth over the last 4 to 5 years. We've delivered EPS growth in excess of 20% over the last 3 years.
He says we've had consistent growth. We've delivered growth in excess of 20%. We've had solid momentum in that market. How would you turn these sentences into more formal descriptions? Take the first sentence. We've had consistent growth. Generally, the first person forms of I and we are not used in more formal writing or when describing economic data. We'd use an objective form. There is, there are, there has been, or there will be. So we've had consistent growth becomes there has been consistent growth. Look at this one. We've delivered growth of 20%. That becomes there has been growth of 20%. Now listen to him again.
We've had solid momentum in that market for 4 or 5 years, and we expect that momentum's going to continue.
He said, we've had solid momentum. We expect that momentum is going to continue. We've had, we expect. How could you write that information in a formal way? We've had solid momentum. There has been solid momentum. We expect that momentum is going to continue. It is expected that momentum is going to continue. So looking for the use of the first person is a good way to tell whether someone is discussing information in a formal or informal way. You should remember that in an academic context, you always need to include evidence to support your opinions or descriptions. You should try to always include data to explain and support what you're saying. Data is information, especially facts and figures, numbers, percentages, and dates. In formal language, you need to include data to support your arguments. Listen to the data Derek uses.
We've delivered EPS growth in excess of 20% over the last 3 years. Growing earnings at 25, 30, 35% forever becomes impossible. I think we end up owning US GDP in about 2023 with 25% growth. We've registered that 15% is our plan, and we think that's a good target.
He mentions a variety of facts and numbers, but he also describes how the data has changed. That is, the degree or type of change. To describe data, there is a variety of word choices. You can use both adjectives and adverbs, words that describe. Of course, adjectives describe things and adverbs describe actions. So you'll need both nouns and verbs for your descriptions. For example, you might use nouns like the rise, the increase, or the growth. Listen to Derek again.
Well, we've said before that we've had consistent growth over the last 4 to 5 years.
They've had consistent growth. He uses an adjective, consistent, with a noun, growth. Let's look at a table. To describe numbers going up, we can use nouns like the rise, the increase, or the growth. And to describe numbers going down, we can use the drop or the decrease. Then we've got adjectives to describe those nouns, like rapid, slow, slight, dramatic, sudden, or consistent. And we can put these together. A sudden rise, a slight decrease, a sudden drop, a consistent growth. But there's another way of describing these changes. We can use verbs and adverbs. Many nouns like the rise, the increase, the growth can be used as verbs. To rise, to increase, to grow, to drop, to decrease. And many adjectives can become adverbs. Rapidly, slowly, slightly, dramatically, suddenly, consistently. By using these new words, we can describe data by using verbs and adverbs. We can say to rise suddenly, to decrease slightly, to drop suddenly, to grow consistently. So look how these phrases change. A sudden rise becomes to rise suddenly. A slight decrease, to decrease slightly. A sudden drop, to drop suddenly. And look at how sentences can be changed to fit these different phrases. It has grown consistently. There has been consistent growth. It's important to always use a variety in your written work. Sometimes use verbs and adverbs to describe data, and sometimes use adjectives and nouns. It will make your English sound much better. Okay, listen to the clip again, and then we'll try to put together all the things we've looked at today. Listen for personal descriptions, simple verbs, and descriptions of data.
Well, we've said before that we've had consistent growth over the last 4 to 5 years. We've delivered EPS growth in excess of 20% over the last 3 years. We've registered that 15% is our plan, and we think that's a good target. We're very happy with our level of sales. We grew sales in the US in girls wear at 50%, and we think that's a fantastic performance.
He finishes by commenting on the data and its significance for the company. Okay, let's go back over the steps we've looked at today. When you're making an argument, it's important to support your case. You must include data or facts. Make sure you discuss this data. Use objective, impersonal language. Describe changes to data by using a variety of noun, adjective and verb, adverb combinations. And finally, comment on the data using formal, objective language. And that's all for Study English today. Don't forget to keep reading, writing, speaking and listening to English as much as you can. And why not try to rewrite some conversational English into more formal academic styles? I'll see you next time for more IELTS preparation. Bye! Hello, I'm Margot Politis. Welcome to Study English, IELTS preparation. Today we're going to be making comparisons and looking at some tricky prepositions of time. But first, let's listen to an academic talking about the Australian economy and the Australian dollar. See if you can hear him use some comparative adjectives.
It couldn't have come at a worse time in the sense that with business investment weakening, and with the housing market, at least in activity terms, having turned, that's where the timing is unfortunate for us. The stronger the value of the Australian dollar, and the longer it stays strong, the weaker our economic activity will be next year. I think growth in 2004 will be comparatively weak. My own prediction is that throughout the year, growth will be around about 2%. Being around the Reserve Bank's board table at this time, I think, would not be a comfortable place to be. The bank is probably in a bigger dilemma over what to do with interest rates, with monetary policy, than any time that I can remember.
Dr. Ian Harper is discussing the value of the Australian dollar and the growth of the Australian economy, including interest rates. He describes all these factors by comparing information. Listen to him talk about the value of the dollar.
The stronger the value of the Australian dollar, and the longer it stays strong, the weaker our economic activity will be next year.
The stronger the value of the dollar and the longer it stays strong, the weaker our economic activity. The adjectives used in the clip are strong, weak and long. The Australian dollar is strong. It is stronger than it used to be. It has been strong for a long time. It is making economic activity weak. The longer it stays strong, the weaker the economic activity. Let's look at comparative adjectives a bit more closely. With single syllable words, we add er. Strong, stronger. Long, longer. Weak, weaker. Big, bigger. But not all adjectives follow this simple pattern. Some are irregular.
It couldn't have come at a worse time.
It couldn't have come at a worse time. Worse. Worse comes from the adjective bad. Bad, worse. Irregular adjectives are often best learnt with the superlative or most form. Bad, worse, worst. And good, better, best. When comparing, there are two ways to do it. To say two things are the same, we use as. Growth is as slow as it was last year. When saying one thing is more than the other, we use the comparative form. We usually use the word than when comparing. Growth is slower than last year. The superlative form, the most or est form, is used with the word the. Growth is the slowest it's ever been. Notice that we usually use more and most with adjectives that have more than 2 syllables. So we have slow, slower, slowest, but beautiful, more beautiful, most beautiful. Okay, now we're going to look at some prepositions of time. Listen for one in this clip.
I think growth in 2004 will be comparatively weak.
He says in 2004. In is a preposition of time. The prepositions of time are at, on, and in. Let's look at how they're all used. At is used for times. For example, the lecture is at 7 o'clock. On is used for days and dates. The lecture is on Thursday. The lecture is on the 27th of October. In is for periods of time and for months, years and seasons. The lecture is in the morning, in June, in 2004, in winter. So we'd say the lecture is at 7 o'clock in the morning, on Thursday, on the 27th of October, in 2004. Notice that we say in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, but we say at night. Now let's test you on these prepositions. I saw her Tuesday, 3 o'clock, the afternoon. We've got the choice of in, at, or on. I saw her on Tuesday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Here's another one. They went shopping night. Friday last week. Shops are open late. Summer. They went shopping at night on Friday last week. Shops are open late in summer. Okay, now let's listen to the whole clip again. See if you can hear how much he thinks the Australian economy will grow.
It couldn't have come at a worse time in the sense that with business investment weakening and with the housing market, at least in activity terms, having turned, that's where the timing is unfortunate for us. The stronger the value of the Australian dollar and the longer it stays strong, the weaker our economic activity will be next year. I think growth in 2004 will be comparatively weak. My own prediction is that throughout the year, growth will be around about 2%. Being around the Reserve Bank's board table at this time, I think, would not be a comfortable place to be. The bank is probably in a bigger dilemma over what to do with interest rates, with monetary policy, than any time that I can remember.
His prediction is for growth to be about 2%. We write 2% like this. Percent comes from the Latin phrase per centum, by the 100 or in every 100. It's used to express proportions out of 100, including rates of interest. Percent is always used with a number. So we say 20% of students attended the lecture. That means 20 out of every 100 students attended. Or she got 90% in the test means she got 90 out of every 100 questions right. Or growth will be around 2%. We also have the word percentage. Percentage is a noun. It means the portion or amount of something. So we say, what was the percentage of students who attended the lecture? 20% of students attended the lecture. She got 90% in her test. That is a high percentage. Okay, now let's test you using percent or percentage. The of high school students that go to university is about 20. The percentage of high school students that go to university is about 20%. The bank has raised the interest rate by 2%. The bank has raised the interest rate by 2%. The of married women in the workforce rose from 50 to 60. The percentage of married women in the workforce rose from 50 to 60%. If his answers are all correct, he'll get 100 on the test. If his answers are all correct, he'll get 100% on the test. So you should note that the signal for using percent is that there's always a number first. And of course, you can always use the percent sign instead of writing out the words. And that's all we've got time for today. I'll see you next time on Study English. Bye-bye. Hello, I'm Margot Politis. Welcome to Study English, IELTS preparation. Today we're going to look at a topic you've probably heard a lot about, global warming and the environment. First, we're going to look at ways of brainstorming, taking notes and developing ideas. Watch while we play some vision that contains ideas about the causes and effects of global warming. While you watch, try to note down some of your ideas about what global warming is. Okay, so you saw some ideas and perhaps took some notes during that clip. What were some of the ideas you saw? What has caused global warming? We saw gases in the air, cars, factory waste, and people cutting trees down. So if you made those notes, you'd get an idea that these were the things causing global warming. Now let's listen to someone talk about the causes.
Heat-trapping gases are building up in the atmosphere.
Heat-trapping gases are building up in the atmosphere. What else?
So what is global warming? It's the result of billions of decisions. It's caused by decisions made by individuals, like driving big cars rather than small cars. And it's caused by decisions made by corporations and nations, like dumping waste into the atmosphere.
Global warming is caused by people using big cars and people dumping waste into the atmosphere. Okay, so you've looked at the vision and listened to the speaker, and you've made notes about some of the causes of global warming. Now, let's look for some of the effects. So after watching that, you might be thinking that global warming is having an effect on weather patterns and on nature. Listen to the speaker.
Nature is already responding to global warming. There have been changes in global weather patterns. Trees are flowering earlier, birds are laying eggs earlier, butterflies are moving up hills.
So there have been weather changes and changes to the ways trees, birds and butterflies behave. So we have a list of causes and a list of effects. You might have identified those things from a text you've read or from listening to someone speak. This is how you can take notes. Once you've got your notes, You need to be able to link those causes and effects in sentences. Let's look at a couple of different ways. The first and most basic way is just making a sequence of statements. This can sometimes be a powerful way of making a connection between things. Listen.
Heat-trapping gases are building up in the atmosphere. Trees are flowering earlier, birds are laying eggs earlier, and butterflies are moving up hills.
From the sequence of information, we realise that birds are laying their eggs earlier because gases are making the earth warmer. So a simple list of statements can show a cause and effect relationship. But there are other ways too. You can use the language of cause and effect. We can say, X causes Y. Driving cars causes air pollution. There are many other word choices as well. Driving cars leads to air pollution. Driving cars results in air pollution. Notice you can also turn the sentence around. Air pollution is caused by driving cars. Air pollution is the result of driving cars. Air pollution is due to driving cars. Listen to an example here.
There have been changes in global weather patterns. Trees are flowering earlier, birds are laying eggs earlier, butterflies are moving up hills. So what is global warming? It's the result of billions of decisions.
He's talking about global warming. Global warming is the result of billions of decisions. Global warming is due to billions of decisions. And remember, we can turn the sentence around and change the phrase. Billions of decisions cause global warming. Billions of decisions result in global warming. Billions of decisions lead to global warming. When you're writing about causes and effects, make sure you use a variety of these kinds of phrases. There are many to choose from, and you should make lists of cause and effect language and the kinds of vocabulary you can use to describe cause and effect relationships. Now listen to another clip.
Trees are flowering earlier, birds are laying eggs earlier, butterflies are moving up hills. So what is global warming? It's the result of billions of decisions.
When you're writing up your notes using cause and effect language, you'll need to be able to follow or track the subject of the text. Let's look at that now. What is global warming? It is the result of billions of decisions. The word it here is called a referent. We use reference to identify and track subjects through a conversation or a piece of writing. If you repeat the subject too many times, your work will sound boring. Listen to this. The woman came into the room. The woman sat down. The woman drank her tea. Look at how we use reference. The woman came into the room. She sat down. She drank her tea. When you are reading, you'll need to be able to understand reference and follow the subject through the text. Other reference are this, that, these, those. Here's the clip again. Listen to the way the reference are used.
What is global warming? It's the result of billions of decisions.
The word it here refers to global warming. What is global warming? Global warming is the result of billions of decisions. And here's another referent.
What is global warming? It's the result of billions of decisions. You can't manage that at the scale of the individual.
He says you can't manage that at the scale of the individual. He means you can't manage global warming at the scale of the individual. But notice how the subject changes.
What is global warming? It's the result of billions of decisions. You can't manage that at the scale of the individual. Managing the atmosphere has to take place at a global level. That's why it needs international agreements.
Managing the atmosphere has to take place at a global level. The subject of this sentence is managing the atmosphere. That's why it needs international agreement. So the it here no longer refers to global warming. Now it is referring to managing the atmosphere. That's why managing the atmosphere needs international agreement. When reading and writing, you must be very careful to notice when subjects change and to be clear about which subject is being referred to. This can be quite tricky sometimes. Next time you see a paragraph, try to highlight all the reference like it, this, that, these, those, he, she, they. Then try to work out what subject they are all referring back to. It's a great exercise and it will help your reading, writing and speaking skills. And that's all for today. Hope you keep enjoying your English studies and study English. I'll see you next time. Hello, I'm Margot Politis. Welcome to Study English, IELTS preparation. Today we're going to talk about the environment. Global warming is caused by the presence of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. One of the worst greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide. We're going to look at the language of cause and effect while we find out why these greenhouse gases are a problem.
The main problem is our use of fossil fuels. So what we've done is put the whole natural system out of balance by digging up coal and oil that took about 200 million years to accumulate, and we're releasing it all in about 100 years. So it's put the whole system just out of balance at the moment, which has resulted in higher levels of these gases in the atmosphere.
That was Dr. Roger Francie talking about the natural system. He says that the natural system is out of balance. He also talked about the causes and effects of this. Listen for the main cause of the natural system being out of balance.
The main problem is our use of fossil fuels.
He says the main problem is our use of fossil fuels. So if we look at a table of cause and effect, we can say that the use of fossil fuels is a cause, and the natural system out of balance is an effect. Listen again.
The main problem is our use of fossil fuels. So what we've done is put the whole natural system out of balance by digging up coal and oil that took about 200 million years to accumulate, and we're releasing it all in about 100 years.
So the natural system has been put out of balance by people digging up and burning coal and oil. This releases gases into the atmosphere. Coal and oil are fossil fuels. So if we go back to the table of cause and effect, we can say that digging up and burning coal and oil is another cause. See if you can hear another effect.
The main problem is our use of fossil fuels. So what we've done is put the whole natural system out of balance by digging up coal and oil that took about 200 million years to accumulate, and we're releasing it all in about 100 years. So it's put the whole system just out of balance at the moment, which has resulted in higher levels of these gases in the atmosphere.
It's put the whole system out of balance, which has resulted in higher levels of gases in the atmosphere. So here, the natural system out of balance is now a cause. It has resulted in or caused higher levels of gases in the atmosphere. This is an effect. To express these relationships, there are many different word choices. We can use verbs like causes, leads to, results in. So we can express the relationship like this. A causes B, A leads to B, A results in B. Listen to an example here.
So it's put the whole system out of balance at the moment, which has resulted in higher levels of these gases in the atmosphere.
Our use of fossil fuels has resulted in higher levels of gases. But we can also express the cause-effect relationship the other way round. Higher levels of gases are the result of our use of fossil fuels. Notice that we use a noun phrase here. This is very common. We can use nouns like the result, the effect, the consequence. If we look at these effect relationships, we can say B is the effect of A, B is the result of A, B is the consequence of A. Remember that it's always important to have a variety in your language. Make sure you use both nouns and verbs to express causes and effects. This will make your written work and your speech sound more interesting. Okay, so Dr. Francie and his team have designed a new way of measuring one of the worst greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere, carbon dioxide. Listen for what they're trying to find out.
We need to understand what happens in the tropics. That's where the biggest forests are, and that's where some of the biggest changes are occurring in terms of human modification of those forests through conversion to agriculture and regular burning of these forests. Our interest is not so much in that diurnal or daily variation. We're interested in what's happening on time scales of days or months or years.
They're interested in what's happening over days, months or years. Their interest is not so much in diurnal or daily variation. The conjunction or here works to connect alternative meanings. In this sense, or means that is, I mean. We're interested in diurnal, that is, daily variation. We're interested in diurnal, I mean daily variation. The second word defines the first. It tells the reader or listener what the more unfamiliar technical word means. Listen again for what diurnal means.
Our interest is not so much in that diurnal or daily variation.
He says diurnal or daily. Diurnal means daily. See if you can work out the meaning of CO2 here. One of the main causes of global warming is CO2, or carbon dioxide. CO2 or carbon dioxide. CO2 is carbon dioxide. When you're looking at environmental issues like global warming and greenhouse gases, it's often necessary to be familiar with these kinds of chemical terms. You should try to learn the more common ones, like CO2. You might want to keep a copy of the periodic table in your notebook. That's the list of all the chemical elements and their abbreviations. Here are some of them. Hydrogen is H, but helium is HE. Notice that with abbreviations of elements, the first letter is always a capital and the others are always small. See if you can guess these ones. Oxygen, that's O, and carbon is C. But they're not always that easy. Lead is PB, and sodium is Na. Okay, now let's listen to Dr. Francie talk about the new CO2 measuring device. Then we'll look at the names of countries and nationalities.
There's been interest from Korea, Japan, France and Malaysia, where the analyser could be installed on a 100-metre tower on the island of Borneo.
He says there's been interest in their device from Korea, Japan, France and Malaysia. It's important to learn and recognise the English names of the major countries of the world, their nationalities and how to spell and pronounce these. It's a good vocabulary exercise to make lists of these families of words. To help you remember them, try grouping countries according to how the nationalities are formed. Notice that they're all spelt with capital letters. We have the AN, An group. Australia, Australian. Korea, Korean. Malaysia, Malaysian. Fiji, Fijian. We have the ESE, ease group. Japan, Japanese. China, Chinese. Vietnam, Vietnamese. Then there's the I group, pronounced I. Bangladesh, Bangladeshi. Kuwait, Kuwaiti. And some nationalities are formed in an irregular way. France, French. New Zealand, New Zealander. Philippines, Filipino. And watch the change in spelling with that one. Why don't you start your own list of English names for countries and their people? Some countries also take separate adjectives that you can learn along with them. And that's all for Study English today. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Hello, I'm Margot Politis. Welcome to Study English, IELTS preparation. Today we have an environmental theme on Study English, but it's an environmental story with a difference. We find out about a new toilet system that has been developed to save the local environment in a Tasmanian park. We're going to be looking at how to talk about processes, so listen carefully to David Holman talk about his new environmentally friendly toilet.
The liquid waste comes from the toilet behind me. There's a containment vessel for the solids. From the bottom of the solids you drain off the liquid and it comes down here, down this pipe. Okay, the pipe tips into this tipping bucket arrangement, and what this does is it fills up to a point and then it suddenly tips, and that will measure each time it tips, so we can calculate the amount of liquid effluent that's gone in. As that fills up, you can see the cowling material here will come in contact with the effluent. The air is drawn in through these holes and will actually direct the air in onto the surface of the water, through the wick and out through the top.
Okay, so David was talking about how his toilet, the EnviroLoo, works. He was describing a process. Today we're going to look at the type of language you'll need to describe processes. We'll listen to David again. This time, listen out for the types of verbs he uses.
The liquid waste comes from the toilet behind me. There's a containment vessel for the solids. From the bottom of the solids you drain off the liquid and it comes down here, down this pipe. Okay, the pipe tips into this tipping bucket arrangement, and what this does is it fills up to a point and then it suddenly tips, and that will measure each time it tips, so we can calculate the amount of liquid effluent that's gone in.
David uses a variety of verbs and tenses, but mostly he uses the simple present tense. The simple present is often used to describe processes and procedures. Let's look at some examples.
The liquid waste comes from the toilet behind me. Okay, the pipe tips into this tipping bucket arrangement, and what this does is it fills up to a point and then it suddenly tips.
There's also another, more formal way of describing processes. That's using the passive voice. In formal academic writing, it's common to use the passive voice for actions in a process or procedure. When you use the passive voice, your writing becomes impersonal and distant. This is more formal and is often more suitable in an academic setting. Listen for a passive verb here.
As that fills up, you can see the cowling material here will come in contact with the effluent. The air is drawn in through these holes.
He says, is drawn in. The air is drawn in. Notice there is no subject, no person or thing doing the action. It is just done. This is called the passive voice. This highlights the process or action rather than the person or thing doing the action. The passive is used when the important thing is not who did the action, but the action itself. This is true when you are describing processes. The process is the same no matter who is doing it, so we choose the passive voice. Let's look a bit more closely at how the passive is formed. Passive verbs are formed by using the verb to be plus the past participle of the verb. Let's look at the verb draw in, to bring something in. The past participle is drawn. This is an irregular past participle. So the passive form is to be drawn in. The different forms of the passive vary according to the action and when the action happened. Okay, so in formal writing, we use the passive form for processes. But David doesn't always use the passive because he's having a conversation with someone. Let's look at one of David's more informal sentences and see how we could change it into a more formal description.
There's a containment vessel for the solids. From the bottom of the solids, you drain off the liquid.
He says, from the bottom of the solids, you drain off the liquid. Let's look at the main part of that sentence. You drain off the liquid. The verb is drain off. In a passive sentence, we'd say is drained off, the past participle with the present tense form of to be. To form the passive, we also need to change the sentence around. Most English sentences use the active form, that's subject, verb, object. But in the passive, sentences begin with the object of the verb. Object, verb, subject. In this sentence, we know that drain off is the verb, you is the subject, and the liquid is the object. So, to form a passive sentence, we'll need to turn the sentence around into object, verb, subject. Notice that we add the word by. The liquid is drained off by you. But in a process, we don't need to include the agent of the verb, so it usually gets left out. Our new, more formal sentence reads, the liquid is drained off. So let's go back to that full sentence. From the bottom of the solids, you drain off the liquid. From the bottom of the solids, the liquid is drained off. Here's another one.
And that will measure each time it tips. So we can calculate the amount of liquid effluent that's gone in.
We can calculate the amount of liquid. The subject is we. This will be dropped in our passive sentence. The object is the amount of liquid. The verb is can calculate. Calculate has the past participle calculated. When there are auxiliary verbs like can, we use the infinitive form of the verb to be. So the full verb phrase, can calculate, becomes can be calculated. Remember that a passive sentence starts with the object, then the verb. So we can calculate the amount of liquid becomes the amount of liquid can be calculated. Okay, let's finish today by testing you on the passive. Listen to the steps in a simple process. This is how you make a cup of coffee. It's in a conversational style. You fill the kettle with water. You turn on the kettle. You boil the kettle. You pour the hot water into a mug. You add some sugar. Then you can drink it. Okay, let's start at the beginning. You fill the kettle with water. What's the verb? Fill. The subject? You. The object? The kettle. The passive verb is filled. The new sentence is, the kettle is filled with water. See if you can do the next one. You turn on the kettle. The verb is turn on. The subject is you. The object is the kettle. The kettle is turned on. You boil the water. The water is boiled. You pour the hot water into a mug. The hot water is poured into a mug. You add some sugar. Some sugar is added. Then you can drink it. Then it can be drunk. But we'd usually say, then it's ready to be drunk. So let's go through that again. The kettle is filled with water. The kettle is turned on. The water is boiled. The hot water is poured into a mug. Some sugar is added. Then it's ready to be drunk. And I think I'll go and make a cup of coffee right now. Don't forget to practice these active and passive sentences. And I'll see you next time for Study English. Bye. Welcome again to Study English, IELTS preparation. I'm Margot Politis. Today we'll look at some words that cause a lot of confusion, the relative pronouns, that, which and who. And then we'll do some pronunciation practice. But first, let's listen to some people talk about a very dangerous tourist attraction from Australia's Northern Territory.
People have always been fascinated with death. Most of the mysteries that you see on television, the films that you see, involve murder of one kind or another. Crocodiles are one of the last remaining dinosaurs, and the idea of a crocodile coming out of the water and grabbing somebody is absolutely riveting.
I read about the death of the German tourist who was taken by a crocodile. It didn't put me off coming to the Northern Territory. Quite the opposite. In fact, I think the Northern Territory is famous for its crocodiles and probably quite famous for its crocodile attacks. And that tourists who come here would like to be or feel as though they were involved in that danger. Tourists want to have a story to take home. And if they can say that they were in the Northern Territory where the German tourist was taken by the croc, then it adds to their own adventure.
So he thinks people may actually be attracted to the Northern Territory because of the dangerous crocodiles. But now we're going to leave the crocodiles and talk about something else that can be dangerous. The relative pronouns who, which and that. Listen for some relative pronouns here.
People have always been fascinated with death. Most of the mysteries that you see on TV, the films that you see, involve murder of one kind or another.
I read about the death of the German tourist who was taken by a crocodile.
Most of the mysteries that you see on TV involve murders. I read about the death of the tourist who was taken by a crocodile. Relative pronouns are used to introduce relative clauses. They give more information about a subject. The subject here is mysteries. The that clause gives us more information about the subject. The mysteries that you see on TV. The tourist is the subject. The who clause gives more information. The tourist who was taken by a crocodile. But how do you choose between who, which or that? Well, the relative pronoun who is only used with people. Which is only used with things. That is usually only used with things as well. Sometimes, in informal language, it can refer to people. But when you're learning English, it's probably best to avoid using that for people. The most difficult thing with these relative pronouns is working out the difference between which and that. As a general rule, we use which when the clause does not affect the meaning of the sentence. A which clause just gives us extra information. It can be left out of a sentence, and the sentence still has the same meaning. When which is used in this type of clause, we put commas around it. The hat, comma, which is on the bed, comma, is new. Here, the clause which is on the bed just gives us additional information. We can take it out and the sentence still makes sense. There is only one hat. It's the hat on the bed. We take out the which clause and the important information is still there. The hat is new. Okay, now let's look at that. We use that for clauses that are a crucial part of the sentence. They are actually part of the definition of the subject. The hat that is on the bed is new. Notice that clauses do not use commas because they are a crucial part of the sentence. There are a number of hats this sentence could be referring to, but the sentence is specifically talking about the hat on the bed, so we use that. The that clause cannot be taken out of this sentence. The hat is new. It doesn't make sense here because it doesn't tell us which hat is being discussed. It would take some practice to get used to who, which and that. To sum up, we use that to define the subject. We use which in a clause with commas to add extra information. You will notice which often being used in place of that, especially in spoken language. While not strictly correct, it is very common. The word who is a bit simpler. It's only used when the subject is a person and can be used in both of these types of clauses. Okay, now we're going to do some pronunciation practice. Students learning English often complain that native speakers speak too fast. Well, it's true. English speakers do run their words together, so it's often very difficult to hear when one word ends and another begins. To make your spoken English sound natural, it's important for you to do this too. You need to learn to link words ending in a final consonant sound to words with an initial vowel sound. Let's look at some words linked with of.
People have always been fascinated with death. Most of the mysteries that you see on television, the films that you see, involve murder of one kind or another. Crocodiles are one of the last remaining dinosaurs, and the idea of a crocodile coming out of the water and grabbing somebody is absolutely riveting.
I read about the death of the German tourist who was taken by a crocodile. It didn't put me off coming to the Northern Territory. It's quite the opposite.
He uses the phrases most of, one of, out of, death of. But in sentences, these phrases will usually become linked together. Most of, most of. One of, one of. Out of, out of. Death of, death of. Notice that of in these phrases is unstressed. Practice these ones. Many of, many of. Most of, most of. One of, one of. Several of, several of. Listen to the differences when I read these sentences in a natural, conversational way. One of my best friends lives here. One of my best friends lives here. Many of the trees have died. Many of the trees have died. I enjoy most of her songs. I enjoy most of her songs.
People have always been fascinated with death. Crocodiles are one of the last remaining dinosaurs, and the idea of a crocodile coming out of the water and grabbing somebody is absolutely riveting.
He says people have always been fascinated with death. People have always. Notice how in conversation we link the final consonant sound v with the initial vowel sound or. Have always. Crocodiles are. Crocodiles are. Is absolutely. Is absolutely. Okay, now let's try these sentences. She is always studying hard. She is always studying hard. They aren't scared by crocodiles. They aren't scared by crocodiles. So make sure you practice words in phrases and sentences. That way you'll get used to linking your words and your spoken English will sound more natural. And don't forget to listen to native speakers as much as you can and try to copy them, even if they do speak fast. And that's all for today. I'll see you next time on Study English. Bye-bye. Hello, I'm Margot Politis. Welcome to Study English IELTS Preparation. Today we're going to talk about acronyms, abbreviations and names, and then we'll do a bit of vocabulary building as well. The boy in today's episode is about to have a test to see whether he has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. While you're watching, listen for some other abbreviations.
How do you know if your child does have ADHD? An EEG brain scan helps answer that, say the Swinburne researchers. Jacques Duff is a psychologist and one of Richard's PhD students. A computer program will compare Xavier's brain scan with a database of scans of ADHD sufferers. If he does have the condition, the ADHD diagnosis will be automatically triggered.
Xavier was having a test to see if he has ADHD. ADHD is an abbreviation. An abbreviation is the short form of a phrase or a word. We often abbreviate phrases using the first letter of each word. Notice that you use capital letters for these types of abbreviations. ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. ADHD is much quicker and easier to say and to write. You might recognise some of these common abbreviations. UFO stands for Unidentified Flying Object. ASAP means as soon as possible. Other common abbreviations are PC for personal computer, TV for television, and CD-ROM. That's a compact disc with a read-only memory. Notice that each letter in the abbreviation is pronounced separately, but the last letter is pronounced more strongly because it carries the primary stress. So we say USA, ASAP, ABC, and TV. Listen for another abbreviation here.
Jacques Duff is a psychologist and one of Richard's PhD students.
Jacques Duff is one of Richard's PhD students. PhD stands for Doctor of Philosophy. Another abbreviation you'll recognise is IELTS. IELTS stands for International English Language Testing System. This form of abbreviation is called an acronym. With an acronym, we don't pronounce the individual letters, we pronounce it as a word. So we say IELTS, not IELTS. Some other examples of acronyms are AIDS, that's Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, and RAM, Random Access Memory. Another example is ASEAN. That stands for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. There's one more common shortening in today's story. Listen for whether it's an abbreviation or an acronym.
An EEG brain scan helps answer that, say the Swinburne researchers.
He says an EEG. That's an abbreviation. We don't pronounce it EEG, we say EEG. EEG stands for electroencephalograph. That's a type of brain scan, but you can see why we shorten it to EEG. Notice that in formal academic writing, it's necessary to write out an abbreviation in full the first time you use it. So, if you wanted to write about an EEG, you'd write it out in full the first time and place the abbreviation in brackets, like this. An electroencephalograph, bracket, EEG, bracket, can help treat patients. After that in your paper, you can just use the abbreviation on its own. Okay, so let's listen to the clip again, but this time listen for words to do with universities.
How do you know if your child does have ADHD? An EEG brain scan helps answer that, say the Swinburne researchers. Jacques Duff is a psychologist and one of Richard's PhD students. A computer program will compare Xavier's brain scan with a database of scans of ADHD sufferers.
He refers to the Swinburne researchers. Swinburne is the name of a university in Victoria. There were also some other university-related words. Jacques Duff is a psychologist and a PhD student. A great way to learn new words is in themes like this and by organising them into word trees. Let's look at university words. Students might study for a diploma, a bachelor degree, an honours degree, a master's degree, or a PhD. Jacques Duff is a PhD student, so that's where he fits into this tree. There are a number of different people and places mentioned in today's story. We don't see them all, but we hear their names. Listen for the names in this clip.
An EEG brain scan helps answer that, say the Swinburne researchers. Jacques Duff is a psychologist and one of Richard's PhD students. A computer program will compare Xavier's brain scan with a database of scans of ADHD sufferers.
The people he mentions are Jacques Duff, Richard, and Xavier. If someone has an uncommon name, people will often ask how their name is spelt. For example, Xavier is an uncommon name in Australia. So if I met Xavier, I might ask him, how do you spell your name? So it's a good idea to get used to spelling out your name. Xavier is spelt like this, X-A-V-I-E-R, Xavier. Jacques is also an uncommon name in English because it's a French name. In this case, we have both a first and a last name. His first name is Jacques, and his last name is Duff. A first name is sometimes called a Christian name. It's also called a given name. It's the name your family chooses for you. The last name is also called a surname or a family name. That's usually the name of one parent that's passed on to their children. Jacques' first name is spelt Jacqueus, and his surname is Duff. Notice that if you ask someone in Australia to spell out the name Duff, they would say D-U-F-F. But in North America, people would spell it like this, D-U-F-F. They don't use the word double. They say the letter twice instead. So if we asked Jacques Duff to spell out his surname, he would say D-U-F-F. Or he might say D-U-F-F. You'll need to be familiar with both ways of spelling out double letters. You should also make sure you know exactly how to spell out your own name in English. That's all for today. I'm Margot Politis. That's M-A-R-G-O-T-P-O-L-I-T-I-S. See you next time. Hello, I'm Margot Politis. Welcome to Study English, IELTS preparation. Today we're going to look at ways of connecting ideas. There are many ways of doing this using conjunctions, words that join. First, let's listen to Paul Gibson, an architect, while he takes us on a tour of his new, environmentally friendly solar house.
Well, we completed it about 2 years ago, and I guess one of the interesting things about it is that it's a fibro house, and most houses, I guess these days, are brick veneer, whereas this is fibre on the outside, timber on the outside, but there's bricks on the inside. Well, I guess the very high windows along the north side, going down to the lower ceiling height on the south, basically allows you to get a lot of sun in through these windows in winter. And the louvers which go out actually go to a point where the sun can be shaded completely in summer, but they can be opened to let the sun right back into the house through winter. This house actually has two north faces. There's the north face of all the living rooms, 3 actually, and then the master bedroom has a north face and the other bedrooms also have a north face. So it's trying to maximise what we call the aperture of the house, which is how much sun you actually get into in winter.
Okay, now we've listened to Paul, let's look at the way he connected his ideas. Good communication, especially in an academic setting, is all about expressing and connecting both simple and complex ideas. There are many ways to do this. Simple sentences express a single, simple idea. The most simple sentence consists of just a subject and a verb. The door opens. The woman enters. The easiest way of connecting ideas is using coordination. That's taking 2 simple sentences and linking them with a conjunction or a joining word. The most common conjunctions are and but. Other common ones are yet, or, for, and so. We use the most simple conjunctions in place of a full stop. The door opens. The woman enters. The door opens and the woman enters. The door opens. The woman doesn't enter. The door opens, but the woman doesn't enter. Listen to an example here.
Well, we completed it about 2 years ago, and I guess one of the interesting things about it is that it's a fibro house, and most houses, I guess these days, are brick veneer.
It's a fibro house and most houses are brick veneer. It is a fibro house. Most houses are brick veneer. These are two simple sentences. They can be linked together to form a longer sentence called a compound sentence. It is a fibro house and most houses are brick veneer. Compound sentences have two independent clauses, two clauses that can be separate sentences. Here's another one.
Ceiling height on the south basically allows you to get a lot of sun in through these windows in winter, and the louvers which go out actually go to a point where the sun can be shaded completely in summer, but they can be opened to let the sun right back into the house through winter.
He's talking about the louvers. He joins together two sentences. The louvers go to a point where the sun can be shaded completely in summer. They can be opened to let the sun back in through winter. He joins these sentences together using but. Notice we use a comma as well. The louvers go to a point where the sun can be shaded completely in summer, comma, but they can be opened to let the sun back in through winter. The conjunctions and but can also be used to join words and phrases in lists. We separate words with commas and then use a final and. The house is made of fibro. The house is made of fibro and timber. The house is made of fibro, timber and bricks. Listen to this example.
Most houses, I guess these days, are brick veneer, whereas this is fibre on the outside, timber on the outside, but there's bricks on the inside.
He forms one compound sentence from simple sentences. The house is fibro on the outside. It is timber on the outside. It is bricks on the inside. Notice that and is used to list similar things, but is used to contrast different items in a list. So we could also say, the house is fibro and timber on the outside, but bricks on the inside. Okay, so that's an introduction to coordination. Remember, coordination is linking independent clauses with conjunctions. This forms compound sentences. Another way to join ideas is using subordination. Subordination is linking an independent clause with a dependent clause to make a complex sentence. Dependent clauses are clauses that cannot exist separately in separate sentences. They need or depend on each other. We can form complex sentences in two ways. We can use relative pronouns, who, whose, which, where, or we can use conjunctions like because or whereas. When writing or speaking, it's important for you to practice using a variety of sentences. You'll need to use simple, compound and complex sentences. Here's another example.
Trying to maximise what we call the aperture of the house, which is how much sun you actually get in winter.
He uses an independent and a dependent clause here. Look at these two sentences. They are trying to maximise the aperture of the house. The aperture of the house is how much sun you get. He joins these two sentences together with a relative pronoun. They are trying to maximise the aperture of the house, comma, which is how much sun you get. Now let's practice that. Join these simple sentences to make compound sentences using coordination. Here, try to use and but. The master bedroom has a north face. The other bedrooms have a north face. The master bedroom and the other bedrooms have a north face. And here's another one. The house is warm in winter. The house is cool in summer. The house is warm in winter, comma, but it's cool in summer. Now let's practice subordination. That's making two sentences into one complex sentence. Try using whereas. The house is warm in winter. Most houses are cold in winter. This can become, the house is warm in winter, comma, whereas most houses are cold in winter. And here's another one. Here, try to link the sentences using which. The house is made of fibro. Fibro is a cheap building material. The house is made of fibro, which is a cheap building material. You'll need to practice forming simple, compound and complex sentences. There are many ways to do it and many different ways of punctuating. This is very important for your written work. And that's all for today. I'll see you next time on Study English. Bye-bye. Hello, I'm Margot Politis. Welcome to Study English, IELTS preparation. Today we're going to look at ways to talk about something that's happened in the past. And we'll also have a look at ways to form compound and complex sentences. First, we're going to listen to a woman talk about a dramatic event in her past. 4 years ago, she had a stroke. A blood vessel burst in her brain. Here's what happened to her.
A stroke is whereby the blood supply to the brain is cut off. The major signs of having had a stroke that most people would equate with is weakness. So paralysis of an arm, leg or face. In others it can be a loss of speech or an ability to communicate. Others may have loss of vision or a combination of all those things.
I was just so physically fit and also emotionally I was on top of the world. I had a really good job at that time and I was getting married. I just felt terribly nauseous and I woke up with pins and needles down one side of my leg. And then it worked its way up towards my arm and across. I was just immobile. I couldn't move, I couldn't walk. I was paralysed on this side of my body.
Simone is telling her story. She is giving a recount of what happened to her and how she was affected. A recount is a story about past events, usually in the order in which they occur. Let's take another look at a clip from today's episode. Listen for the past tense verbs in Simone's story.
I was just so physically fit and also emotionally I was on top of the world. I had a really good job at that time and I was getting married.
She says, I was so physically fit. I was on top of the world. I had a really good job. Here, was and had are past tense verbs. They're irregular verbs. Let's compare the three forms of these irregular verbs. From the infinitive form of the verb to be, we can form the simple present forms am, is and are. And we can also make the simple past forms was or were. Notice that the verb to be is the only verb in English that has two past tense forms. All others just have one. Let's do the same for the verb to have. What is the simple present form of the verb to have? Has or have. And the simple past form? Had. When you learn new verbs, it's important to learn them with all their different forms. So make sure you write verbs down in a notebook and work out all their different tenses as well. When you are recounting a story that happened in the past, you'll need to use all these simple past tense forms of verbs. You'll also need to use a variety of transition signals, words that help to order the events. Using transition signals will help the reader or listener follow the order of events in the story. Listen for the transition signal in this clip.
I just felt terribly nauseous and I woke up with pins and needles down one side of my leg. And then it worked its way up towards my arm and across.
She uses the word then. Then is very common in informal spoken language. So are other informal transition signals like next or after that. Simone said she had a feeling of pins and needles in her leg. Then it worked its way to her arm. In more formal language, you might find transition signals like at first, subsequently, or after a while. If we wanted to make Simone's story clearer, we could add some transition signals to her story. If we were writing her story, we might use more formal transition signals. Simone had a feeling of pins and needles in her leg. Then it worked its way to her arm. We might say, at first, Simone had a feeling of pins and needles in her leg. After a while, it worked its way to her arm. Notice that transition signals like this are often followed by commas. Adding transition signals has made Simone's story clearer. You can more easily see the order of events. This is very important in formal language. Try to make sure you learn and use a number of different transition signals. Now let's have another listen to a clip of Simone talking about her illness. Pay attention to the type of sentences that Simone uses. Are the sentences simple, compound, or complex?
It worked its way up towards my arm and across. I was just immobile. I couldn't move, I couldn't walk. I was paralysed on this side of my body.
Most of the sentences that Simone uses are simple sentences. If we wanted to write an account of Simone's illness, we could join up some of these sentences to make compound and complex sentences. We form compound and complex sentences by joining simple sentences and phrases together. Simone says, I was just immobile. I couldn't move. I couldn't walk. But we could edit this to say, I was just immobile. I couldn't move or walk. Or, I was just immobile. I could neither move nor walk. Okay, now let's finish with a quick look at the words used in the clip. Listen to the clip one more time and then we'll talk about a quick way to build your vocabulary. Listen again.
I was just immobile. I couldn't move, I couldn't walk. I was paralysed on this side of my body.
Simone says she was immobile. The prefix im is used to make the opposites of words beginning with M or P. Im means not. So immobile is the opposite of mobile. It means not mobile. So we can have mobile and immobile, mature and immature, polite and impolite, patient and impatient. Knowing the opposites of words is very important. Many words just have a different word that means the opposite, like hot, cold, happy, sad, in, out, up, down. But other words take prefixes that mean not, like un, dis, in. Listen to some of the clip again, then we'll look at how a few more opposites are formed.
The major signs of having had a stroke that most people would equate with is weakness. So paralysis of an arm, leg or face. In others it can be a loss of speech or an ability to communicate.
He says a sign of a stroke can be an inability to communicate. He uses the in prefix, meaning not. Inability means not having the ability. And here's a few more opposites. She says she was physically fit, emotionally on top of the world. The opposite of fit is unfit. The opposite of emotionally is unemotionally. A great tip is to try to find words with opposite meanings. Some words have several meanings, so they have several opposites as well. A good thesaurus will really help you with this. And that's all from me today. Don't forget to practice forming compound and complex sentences, and remember to practice reading and writing in English every day. I'll see you next time on Study English. Bye. Hello, I'm Margot Politis. Welcome again to Study English IELTS Preparation. Today we're going to look at cycles, at phrasal verbs, and then we'll finish with a bit of punctuation. But now here's a man who is a microbiologist and a mushroom grower. He's talking about mushrooms and the part they play in the carbon cycle.
They occur naturally in the forests as wood-degrading fungi. That's their job. When trees die, they grow on the tree, they break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
The speaker, Noel Arrold, is talking about how mushrooms grow naturally. They are an important part of the carbon cycle. But what is a cycle? A cycle is a process that is repeated over and over. It goes around and around. But how do we know this from listening to Noel?
When trees die, they grow on the tree, they break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
He says, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on. By saying the cycle goes on, he is telling us that this process happens again and again. At the end of the description, you need to signal that the process goes back to the beginning again. We can say the process goes on, the process begins again, the process repeats itself. In a cycle, there is no real end or beginning because the process just keeps going. When describing a cycle, we need to start somewhere, then describe in order each part of the cycle. There are many different ways of describing the stages of a cycle. We can use transition signals like when, once, then, or next. When speaking, you can also use pauses and intonation to describe a cycle. In written language, this becomes punctuation. Listen to Noel Arrold again describing the different parts of the cycle.
When trees die, they grow on the tree.
He says, when trees die, they grow on the tree. When trees die, comma, they grow on the tree. The first part of the cycle is that the trees die. The second part is that when the trees die, Fungi grow on the trees. That's the next stage.
When trees die, they grow on the tree, they break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms.
Okay, he says that the fungi break down the lignin and the cellulose. They break down the tree. So the third stage is that the fungi break down the tree. Fourth, they produce mushrooms.
When trees die, they grow on the tree, they break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil. And so
He says, in turn, organic matter goes back into the soil. In turn signals the next stage of the process. In turn means next or because of that. That's the fifth stage. The organic matter goes back into the soil. And then what happens?
when trees die, they grow on the tree, they break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
The carbon cycle in the forest goes on. The organic matter helps new trees to grow again, and then those trees die. We're back to the first stage again. This is the carbon cycle. Okay, now we're going to look at some phrasal verbs. Phrasal verbs consist of a verb followed by a preposition. This forms a new verb, sometimes related to the original verb, but sometimes not. Phrasal verbs are idiomatic. There's no pattern to the meanings they take, and they often have a number of different meanings. You often can't just guess the meanings of phrasal verbs, you have to learn them. Let's look at the phrasal verbs in this clip.
They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
There were 4 phrasal verbs. They were break down, end up, and 2 using go. Go back and go on. Notice that sometimes the preposition will give you an indication as to what the phrasal verb might mean. Let's look at these 4. See if you can match the meanings. Break up, end up, go on, go back, and finish, continue, decompose, return. Well, break up means to decompose. Go back means to return. Go on means to continue, and end up means to finish. But notice that break up can sometimes mean finish as well. We can break up from school. In formal writing, we would be more likely to use words like continue or return than phrasal verbs, which tend to be less formal. Phrasal verbs are difficult to learn because there are so many of them. Look at go. We've already seen it with go back and go on, but there's many, many more. And remember, most of these have got more than one meaning. It takes a lot of time to get used to all the phrasal verbs and what they mean. You need to listen carefully to people speaking and the way they use phrasal verbs. Another important thing to do is to write them down in groups and buy a good phrasal verb dictionary. So pay attention to those phrasal verbs. Learning them in groups can be fun, and your spoken English will sound much more natural. Now we're going to look at some writing tips. For variety, it's important that you use a lot of different sentence types of different lengths. The difficult thing is finding the balance. You can join together short sentences using conjunctions, but what do you do with sentences that are too long? This sentence has many ideas, all joined together with and. How many ands are there in the sentence?
They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
There are 4 ands. This sentence is too long and should be edited. The ideas can be broken down into smaller groups and shorter, clearer sentences. There are several ways of doing this. We can use punctuation, conjunctions, and connectors. So let's have a look. Here's the full sentence. We can start by using punctuation. Use a comma to separate clauses. Use full stops to separate complete ideas. And you can replace some of the ands with full stops. But remember, the new sentence must now start with a capital letter. Now we have a clear paragraph expressing a number of ideas with different kinds of sentences. And the carbon cycle goes on. But we can't go on. It's time to end this episode of Study English. But I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Hello, welcome to Study English, IELTS Preparation. I'm Margot Politis. We're going to look at articles today, indefinite articles a and an, and the definite article the. But first, let's meet an oceanographer. She's talking about using underwater devices to predict weather patterns. See if you can hear her using articles while she talks about monsoons.
The monsoon gets a lot of its energy from the equatorial and subtropical Indian Oceans. Dr. Susan Widgefalls, an oceanographer from Australia's CSIRO, is hoping that by measuring the state of the Indian Ocean in those areas, scientists will be able to learn something about monsoon predictability.
Predicting the monsoon is a very difficult thing, and yet it impacts on millions and millions of people, and so we think that if we can predict the monsoon usefully, we could make a real difference. We know from El Niño that it's a fully global system, so you can't just study one small part of the ocean and solve these problems. You really need a global integrated observing system, and the Argo program is the first real big ocean attempt to do that, and it's the float technology that's allowed us to even think about doing this.
Using articles before nouns is one of the most difficult things about learning English. You can choose between indefinite articles, a and an, the definite article the, or no article at all. Let's start with the indefinite articles a and an. The rule is that a is used before words starting with a consonant, and an is used before words starting with a vowel. So we have a banana, but an apple. There are a couple of exceptions to the rule. Where the consonant H is not pronounced, we use an. So we say, a happy man, but an honest man. The H is not pronounced, so honest sounds like it starts with a vowel. And where the vowel U is pronounced y, we use a. So we say an umbrella, but a user, because user sounds like it begins with a Y. A and an are only used with singular nouns. We use some with plural nouns. The indefinite articles a or an are used to refer to indefinite things, things that aren't specific. You use them when you're referring to any member of a group of things. The indefinite article does not refer to a particular thing, but one out of many possible things. If I say, I would like a banana, I just want any banana, it doesn't matter which one. Let's look at an example of indefinite articles from the clip.
Predicting the monsoon is a very difficult thing, and yet it impacts on millions and millions of people, and so we think that if we can predict the monsoon usefully, we could make a real difference.
She uses the indefinite article twice. She says, predicting the monsoon is a very difficult thing. There are many things that are difficult to do, and predicting the monsoon is just one of them. Secondly, she says we can make a real difference. There are many differences that can be made in the world, but she is just talking about one of them. So when do we use the definite article the or the? Well, we use it when we're referring to definite, specific things. We also use the when we're talking about one particular member of a group. Luckily, there is only one form of the word the, and it can refer to both singular and plural nouns. We say the banana and the bananas. There is a difference in pronunciation though. When the comes before a vowel sound, we say the apples. So the before vowel sounds and the before consonant sounds. Let's look at the clip again. Listen for the.
You really need a global integrated observing system, and the Argo program is the first real big ocean attempt to do that, and it's the float technology that's allowed us to even think about doing this.
She says the Argo program. She uses the because there is only one Argo program. It's a unique particular thing. She also says the float technology. She is talking about that particular type of float technology, not just any float technology. There was a third the. She said the first real big ocean attempt. We use the in front of first, second and so on because they refer to something particular or unique. There can only be one first attempt. In the same way, we use the in front of superlatives. The best example, the biggest banana, and so on, because there can only be one best or biggest of anything. Okay, so that's the major difference between definite and indefinite articles. But there are other rules as well. We use a and an with countable nouns. That is, if the noun can be counted. I ate an apple. Apples can be counted. We use the with uncountable nouns, with things that you can't count. I swam in the water. Water cannot be counted. I drank the milk. Milk cannot be counted. We also use a with counting expressions like a bottle of, a cup of, a bit of. Listen to this.
The monsoon gets a lot of its energy from the equatorial and subtropical Indian Ocean.
She says the monsoon gets a lot of its energy. Look at the monsoon and the Indian Ocean. These are both examples of other rules for the. We can use the to describe generic nouns. A generic noun is a noun that describes a category or type of thing. It can often be the same as using a plural noun. So sometimes the monsoon means the same as monsoons. She's talking about monsoons in general.
Predicting the monsoon is a very difficult thing, and yet it impacts on millions and millions of people, and so we think that if we can predict the monsoon usefully, we could make a real difference. We know from El Niño that it's a fully global system, so you can't just study one small part of the ocean and solve these problems.
And here's another rule. We use the with oceans, seas, rivers and deserts. We say the Indian Ocean, the Yangtze River, the Gobi Desert. We also use the for points on the globe, the equator, the Tropic of Capricorn, the North Pole. Choosing the right article can be very confusing, but if you follow the general rule that you use the definite article, to refer to a particular thing or things, and a and an indefinite articles to refer to one of a number of things, you shouldn't go too wrong. Okay, so now we've seen how to use definite and indefinite articles, but sometimes we don't use articles at all before nouns. Let's look at when to use no article. We've already seen that you can leave the article out when talking about plural generic nouns. Monsoons are unpredictable. But this is true for other generic nouns too. Coffee is delicious. Happiness is hard to find. Balls are round. Okay, so let's look at some sentences. I would like a cake. I would like one cake, any cake. I would like the cake. I would like that particular cake. I like cakes. I like all cakes. Here, cakes with no article is generic. It refers to cakes in general, all cakes. Well, that's all for today. Don't forget to practice those articles, and I'll see you next time for Study English. Bye-bye. In today's episode, we're going to hear someone talking about a new type of crime, electronic crime. Listen carefully to this police officer. Then we're going to look at word families and do some spelling.
It is a new frontier, and there are